Thank you all for being here. My name is Francisco Aragon, and I direct Letras Latinas, the literary initiative at Notre Dame's Institute for Latino Studies. And it is now my great pleasure to welcome to the podium the director of the Institute for Latino Studies, Luis Fraga, who would like to share a few words.
Hello, everyone. I am having some vision problems, so if you hear me stumble on these beautiful remarks, that's the reason. Thank you very much, Francisco, for asking me to say a few words about the Institute for Latino Studies generally. I've been director for, I think it's 5 years, 6 years, something like that. I'm also a professor of political science, and I always enjoy programs put on by Letras Latinas. Some of you may have heard me say this before, but I've come to realize in over 40 years of being a political scientist that the research that we do in the social sciences doesn't last. There's always new research that comes in, or new paradigms, or new statistical methods, things of that sort, all part of the progress that is normally made in intellectual inquiry. But the literary arts, and poetry especially, last. They last for generations and generations. There is a foundational sense of culture and emotion and perspective that poetry, I think, brings, as some of the other literary arts do as well. So it's especially, I think, especially an honor for me to be invited by Francisco and the Letras Latinas program to be here with you. Welcome to all of you, bienvenidos y bienvenidas, for being here. We appreciate you being here very much. This is the celebration of the Letras Latinas' 20th anniversary. We just finished celebrating the 25th anniversary of the Institute for Latino Studies. So the Letras Latinas program was one of the first programs established at the Institute for Latino Studies, and has been thriving, absolutely thriving, under the leadership of Francisco Aragon. Now, the mission of the Institute for Latino Studies is pretty simple. We're the best of Notre Dame. That is, as you know, Notre Dame has always been a place where predominantly immigrant and immigrant origin, predominantly working class, predominantly Catholics could find a home, could find a place to receive higher education, study hard, and try to transform the world, as we say, following Father Soren's charge to us that we be an institution that was committed to doing good in the world. Who is that community today? Well, a substantial part of that community is the Latino community, the Latina community, Latinx communities, whatever your preferred term is, and they're all appropriate in their specific contexts. And Notre Dame, through the Institute for Latino Studies, made a commitment 25 years ago to make sure that it put its, although we would always want more, financial resources, its faculty resources, its intellectual resources, its student body, that it always was going to be a place that was at the forefront of the best research, teaching, and service, with a clear understanding of the role of Latino communities. Well, why would it do that? Well, it did it because As you know, Latinx communities are the future of the country, or at least part, an important part, an increasingly growing part of the future of our nation, and an even more sizable part of the future of the Catholic Church. And so Notre Dame, as a preeminent Catholic institution, said, we need to do something. We need to be intentional in our demonstration and recognition of the nature of the changing Catholic community and the changing country. And we want to be asking the most important questions. We want to be trying to work with our faculty and students to develop answers to those, at times, challenging questions. Questions like, to what extent are Latino communities similar, and to what extent are they different than other communities that have been part of the country or come in as initially immigrant communities but then stay over generations. Questions like, what is the role of Latino communities in expanding our, what I'm going to call, multicultural democracy, or at least attempt at a multicultural democracy, which, as all of you know, we still struggle with today to try to build, and have struggled throughout the history of our country. We at the Institute take these questions and others that come from our faculty, many of whom are seated here in this room, that come from our faculty, whatever their disciplinary expertise, and we try to support them in that work, and support their graduate students in that work, and support our undergraduate students in that work. More recently, the Institute, I'll stop here in just a minute. More recently, the Institute for Latino Studies has established what we call our Latino Studies Scholars Program. That program is the only one of its kind at any university in the United States. We give a scholarship, about half of Notre Dame tuition, from revenues that we have very generously received from individuals like a former member of our Board of Trustees, Nacho Lozano, and members of our advisory council who have contributed as well. We're able to give a scholarship to 8 to 12 students a year of half Notre Dame tuition because of the leadership they have already shown in Latino communities as high school students. And if they can gain admission to Notre Dame through the traditional process, you know, standardized test scores and essays and GPA and letters of recommendation and essays that they write, and they have a demonstrated commitment to Latino communities, we tell them, we want you at Notre Dame. It's a merit scholarship, not a need-based scholarship. It's because of the work they've done and the work that they're likely to want to do in the future, whatever their chosen career. Art, medicine, creative writing, poetry, the academy, ministry, although we haven't had any priests come through our way or budding priests come our way, whatever area of work they're in, and they also want to be working on behalf of Latinx communities as part of their professional development. Major in whatever major they want. They can come from any ethnic racial background. It's not just for Latino students. They can come from middle-class families and upper-income families. And as you know, middle-class families are particularly challenged in meeting our annual budget for a student and expenses. And of course, if they come from a family of need, a family of limited resources, the university generously provides them the financial aid that they need, the other amounts of financial aid. But we want them here because of their commitment to get ahead as individuals through our program and to bring others with them. Their commitment to simultaneously get ahead and give back. We now have about 40 students in our program. If you're interested in contributing to it, please let me know. I'll hang around the entire time. But give to the Letras Latinas program first, because I think that's of course, the reason that we're here. Letras Latinas, last point I'll make, has been a gift to ILS, the Institute for Latino Studies, and to Notre Dame. Under Professor Aragon's leadership, and because of his own position and standing in the poetry community here in the country, we have had access to incredible poets, such as the ones that we're going to hear from tonight. We have been present. By we, I mean the Letras Latinas program, the Institute for Latino Studies, and the University of Notre Dame. We have been present at major poetry readings, and we have award presentations where we've been at, and we've been able to have individuals who are poet laureates of a variety of levels of our society, including poet laureates of the United States and other communities as well. We grow because of the Letras Latinas program, and it gives me great pleasure to welcome you and to invite Francisco Aragon to please come up to the podium again as we continue with our program. Thank you so, so much for being here.
Thank you, Luis, for all the support the Institute has provided to Letras Latinas under your leadership. I'd also like to echo Luis's welcome for what promises to be a special program, one we could not have carried out without our co-sponsors, both on campus and off, starting with the Library of America, the Poetry Foundation, the St. Joe County Public Library, and on campus, the Creative Writing Program, the Jose E. Fernandez Hispanic Caribbean Studies Initiative, the Department of Romance Languages and Literatures, the Initiative on Race and Resilience, and the Center for Social Concerns. And you'll find our roster of private benefactors on the last page of your program. The two poets we're presenting today, I'm happy to report, have long-standing ties to Letras Latinas. My affiliation with one of them predates my time at Notre Dame. The year was 2000 when I found myself at Chamartín train station in the north of Madrid. I was there to pick up Rigoberto Gonzalez, who was spending a few days in the Spanish capital before traveling south. He'd recently completed the manuscript of poems that would become Other Fugitives and Other Strangers. During his month-long stint in Andalusia on a writing residency, he would work on Butterfly Boy, Memories of a Chicano Mariposa, his award-winning memoir. To date, Rigoberto Gonzalez has authored 18 books. And the number of Letras Latinas projects he's been involved with are too numerous to name, but I'll highlight two. About 10 years ago, he accepted our commission to write a lecture on the state of Latino poetry. And he delivered that lecture at the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C. A few years later, he wrote, at our behest, an essay that became this artisan chapbook, a gorgeous, sprawling reflection on 6 folios of ekphrastic poetry published in 6 literary journals, including the March 2016 issue of Poetry magazine. The poems in question were all responding to the Smithsonian American Art Museum's multi-year traveling exhibit, Our America, the Latino Presence in American Art. One of my favorite memories of Richard Blanco was when, in early 2008, he made the trip from Miami to Palm Beach. No, not to Mar-a-Lago, but rather to the Society of Four Arts on the occasion of a Letras Latinas multi-author book tour to promote this anthology. Later, Richard, a contributor himself, would read from this volume at Hugo House in Seattle. He would eventually make his way to Notre Dame for both a reading and an oral history interview. Unfortunately for the latter, his lapel mic malfunctioned, so one has to lean in to hear precisely what he's saying. Thankfully, poet Emma Trellis, who you can read about in your program, conducted a new and, dare I say, tell-all interview with Richard this afternoon, and who will be introducing him in a moment. And then there's this. A few years into our friendship, unprompted, Richard sent me in the mail a lovely pocket journal with a handwritten note expressing gratitude. That's Richard. Before we hear from Emma, I'd like to invite to the podium a very special guest. She is both an artist in her own right, as you can read in your program, and also a representative of the Library of America. I met her in person for the first time today, but these last several months, since she assumed her post as the Latino Poetry Fellow at the Library of America, she has been a delight to work with in devising ways to amplify the groundbreaking anthology we are celebrating today, in addition to Letras Latinas' 20th anniversary. Please join me in giving a Notre Dame welcome to Susana Platz Pineda.
Thank you so much, Francisco and Letras Latinas, for having me to the Institute of Latino Studies. I'm really honored to be here. I'm the Latino Poetry Project Fellow at the Library of America, and I'm going to briefly talk about that in a second, but I'll just speak a little on the Library of America. Founded in 1982, Library of America is a nonprofit organization dedicated to publishing great American writing in authoritative editions, prioritizing authorial intention through careful scholarship and research. Library of America editions encompass all periods and genres, collected works of seminal authors, anthologies, acknowledged classics, neglected masterpieces, and historically important documents and texts, showcasing the variety of American literature. So in this, the Library of America also seeks to redefine and expand the boundaries of what we consider a canon and what we consider an American literary canon. So today, in addition to celebrating the new and selected poems of these two brilliant poets, Richard Blanco and Rigoberto Gonzalez, we're also celebrating the monumental collection of Latino poetry put together with brilliance and care by Rigoberto. Spanning 5 centuries and featuring the work of over 180 poets, Latino Poetry, the Library of America Anthology is the first comprehensive collection of Latino poetry of this size and breadth, a long overdue and necessary effort. It offers a full picture of the multifaceted, multilingual, continually evolving poetic contributions of the Latin American diaspora, starting with poems documenting first encounters between indigenous people and settlers on this continent, to the contributions of monumental revolutionary figures in exile in the 19th century, such as Lola Rodriguez de Tio and José Martí, to paradigmatic texts of mid-20th century movements, aesthetic and political, essential contributions from the Chicano movement, the Fresno School, Nuyorican poets, as well as songs, corridos, contemporary lyric, and experimental poetry. Something that I think is really special about the anthology is that 140 of those poets are living and writing today. So as an extension of the books that Library of America publishes, we also support a wide range of free public programs that bring these books into people's lives and communities where they can take on a new cultural life. So this collection is the centerpiece of a national public humanities initiative supported by the NEH called Latino Poetry Places We Call Home. And it includes events around the country, ranging from launch events at major festivals like the Miami Book Fair, which both Richard and Rigoberto will be at, to intimate library discussion groups, as well as an online media archive featuring readings and interviews by poets from the anthology, such as Ada Limon, Brandon Som, of course Richard, Rigoberto, and many others. So you can can learn more about this project and these events and the book at latinopoetry.org. Thank you so much.
In addition to today's event, which is a partnership with Library America, Letras Latinas will also be doing one at the Folger Library next month. And we'll also be doing one next April at the Martin Luther King Jr. Library in downtown Washington, D.C., among others. I now want to invite to the podium the person who will be introducing our first reader. I've known Emma since 2008. She was actually at that reading in Palm Beach, Florida as well. Emma is the winner of the Andres Montoya Poetry Prize. She also was instrumental in our Pintura Palabra initiative, where she taught one of the ekphrastic workshops at Florida International University in 2014. Please join me in welcoming Emma Treyes.
Thank you, Francisco, and thank you all for your presence tonight. It's a pleasure to be here to celebrate the art of language and the enormous contributions Letras Latinas and Latine poets have made to it. I've been asked to introduce Richard Blanco in a way that speaks to his poetry and his personhood. And I'm delighted to do this because I've known Rick now for more than 25 years. And I've watched him grow as an artist and as a generous human who's always given back to our communities in ways that feel personal. That is to say, in ways that seek to elevate poems and the poets who make them, so both feel as necessary as sleeping or breathing. In her essay, Poetry is Not a Luxury, Audre Lorde, and I'm paraphrasing here, writes that the quality of light by which we document our lives has a direct bearing on the way we change and shape them. Richard illuminates many fractals of the Latina experience through his own work, and also by amplifying the poems of others in myriad ways, decades worth of writing, teaching, reading, sharing, publishing, and more. His light is an abundant one, and it centers on creativity as a conduit for recognizing our shared humanity. The first time I laid eyes on Richard was also the first time I heard him read, and it was at a Barnes & Noble in a Miami mall, the kind with bad fluorescent lighting and indoor ferns, and where young poets had gathered nervously to share our work. His reading was quiet and understated and vulnerable, and I like to remember that he read a poem about his mother shopping for produce and how beautiful she looked, holding grapes that he likened to dusted rubies. But the truth is, I don't know if that was the poem he read. My memory has shaped that time similarly to how we mostly write poetry, after the lived experience has unfolded and time has created a room for honesty and invention. Even at the very beginning of his own artistic trajectory, Richard's poems were complete and authentic, true to his humble beginnings as an outsider in a working-class immigrant family, and true to the visual heartbeat in all of his writing, the image. I didn't realize it back then, but in that Miami mall, he inspired me to begin cultivating that fledgling aesthetic in my own writing, to consider poems as documentary, how they are also films or photographs constructed from the presence and absence of language, and to understand that poetics can be a method of preservation, of remembering what matters and what it means to be alive. I'm grateful to him for this and for so much more. I ask you to join me in welcoming a poet who I've long admired and a dear friend who is also my family, Richard Blanco.
Emma, thank you so much. I ditto. There's so many. I'm not going to introduce you, but I could too. Like with so many beautiful moments and memories. Thank you, everyone. It's an honor and pleasure, of course, to be with all of you here today. Thanks to Francisco, Letras Latinas, the Institute, everyone responsible for putting together this wonderful gathering. I'm just going to read from my most recent book, Homeland of My Body, which is a new and selected volume. And so I'm going to share, just for some context, maybe some artistic, historical context, one of the earlier poems, which I think touches on what I think is my main obsession or my main question throughout my entire body of work, which is that question, that proverbial question of home and all that calls into mind with respect to family, community, culture, identity, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Just a brief background on this first poem. I had traveled in that proverbial, trying to find that answer to that proverbial question of home. I lived in several countries, several cities, and traveled extensively. And eventually, I fell upon this quote by Pascal that says that the sole cause of a man's unhappiness is that he does not know how to stay quietly in his room. And so I thought, what is that figurative room that I left? Has this search for home been a wild goose chase? And I moved back to Miami, which is where I was raised, thinking this is the only place that understands me, this world between two worlds, between the Cuba and the America and the U.S. So moved there. Thought I was just going to pop right back in, and this was home. And this is what happened on one of these trips to one of my a locale, taking that proverbial trip down memory lane to a place I used to vacation with my parents since I was a kid into my 20s. Looking for the Gulf Motel, Marco Island, Florida. There should be nothing here I don't remember. The Gulf Motel with mermaid lampposts and ship's wheel in the lobby should still be rising out of the sand like a cake decoration. My brother and I should still be pretending we don't know our parents, embarrassing us as they roll the luggage cart past the front desk, loaded with our scruffy suitcases, 24 loaves of Cuban bread, brown bags bulging with enough mangoes to last the entire week, our espresso pot, the pressure cooker, and a pork roast reeking garlic through the marble lobby. All because we can't afford to eat out, mijo. Not even on vacation. Only 2 hours from our home in Miami, but far enough away to be thrilled by the wider sands on the west coast of Florida, where I should still be, for the first time, watching the sun set instead of rise over the ocean. There should be nothing here I don't remember. My mother should still be in the kitchenette of the Gulf Motel, her daisy sandals from Kmart still squeaking across the linoleum, still gorgeous in her teal swimsuit and amber earrings, stirring a pot of arroz con pollo, adding sprinkles of onion powder and dollops of tomato sauce. My father should still be in a terry cloth jacket, smoking, clinking a glass of amber whiskey in the sunset at the Gulf Motel, watching us dive into the pool, 2 sons he'll never see grow into men who will be proud of him. There should be nothing here I don't remember. My brother and I should still be playing parcheesi. My father should still be alive, slow dancing with my mother on the sliding glass balcony of the Gulf Motel. No music. Only the waves keeping time. A song only their minds hear, 10,000 nights back to their life in Cuba. My mother's face should still be resting against his bare chest, like the moon resting on the sea and the stars. The stars should still be turning around them. There should be nothing here I don't remember. My brother should still be 13, sneaking rum in the bathroom and sculpting naked women from sand. And I should still be 8 years old, dazzled by seashells and how many seconds I can hold my breath underwater. But I'm not. I'm 38, driving up Collier Boulevard, looking for the Golf Motel, for everything that should still be, but isn't. I want to blame the condos, their shadows for ruining the beach in my past. I want to chase the snowbirds away with their tacky mansions and yachts. I want to turn the golf courses back into mangroves. I want to find the Golf Motel exactly as it was and pretend for a moment nothing lost is lost. So just a couple of the new poems from the New and Collected. So where I am on the space of home now, after so many iterations and hopes and disillusionments and whatnot, after so many dead ends and so many happy moments as well, I'm kind of realizing that I've never lost a home, that all the homes exist in me in some ways, that they're all part of my psyche, they're all part of who I am. And this is in the way where the title comes from the collection, Homeland of My Body, that it's all in me. And there's a lot more going on in the book, but I also realized that in a way, language itself is a kind of home, that art itself is a kind of home. The poetry, of course, is a kind of home. And this poem is sort of a very early childhood poem. That moment where I think I found language for the first time. In some ways, that moment would become conscious of language, of abstract language. And it was centered around this narrative of that happened. The splintering. As a boy, I was all body, my body part of all that was. My ears were the wind my cheeks heard, my mouth the thunder that roared in my chest. My face in the face of rain puddles cupped in my palms, my lips the wet petals my nose kissed. And I blindly saw the stars as my eyes, luring me that night to climb up our backyard mango tree. Its trunk, the will of my spine, my arms, every branch's arms, coddling the wind. Its bark, the thick flesh of my hands, needled with splinters when I fell into my mother's terrible cries. Ay, Dios mío. I couldn't grasp her urgency. Why she had to tenderly soak my hands, as if I was some hurt animal she had to heal. Why she spent hours pulling out every splinter with her tweezers, a surgeon operating on me in her housecoat and terry cloth slippers. Why her teary words, it's okay, just a few more, mijo. You could have died. Die? I knew nothing of dying. Then she kissed the last bead of blood on my finger and said, I love you. Te quiero, meaning what she'd love forever was more than my body, which suddenly split from me into abstract breaths in the mouth of my mind, for the first time saying to itself, death, joy, loss, saying, I love you too, Mama. I think I'll end with this poem. Brevity is not the soul of any Cuban's wit, so my poems tend to be longer. Also in this process of re-examining home, I ended up moving part-time back to Miami, living 3 blocks away from where I wrote my first book. And so that does things to you. In part, this is one of those re-examining those beachscapes, those seascapes that are still part of my psyche. But also, this is a little bit of a other genesis as well. as many stories start, I heard on NPR, there was a discussion about when Moses is called by God, by the burning bush, that he says, "Here I am," instead of "I am here." And the semantics of that was really interesting in the discussion, which is if you place the I first, there's the ego comes first, right? But if you say "here I am," the implication is that the ego comes second, that I'm answering the call without even knowing what I'm being asked to do. And so for me, my burning bush is is the beach, is that landscape. It's my God. It's where I go to think and sort of try to connect with the divine. This is no political implication. I know we're in a time now, but this is really just about language. And so the Hebrew word for "here I am" is hineni. God of these waves' gracious hands anointing my feet, hineni. Here I am, again, trudging along the shore with the sins of my greed for love, sins of my gluttony for a homeland, sins of my wrath against myself. Hineni, here I am, again, asking the ebb to wash my guilt back into the depths of forgiveness. God of these salt-laden breaths, these breezes, hineni, here I am, again breathing their balm into my body of hurt, that I might heal, exhale words to ease this world's aching. God of these devout seagulls peering into our everyday eternity, inscribed anew across the pale blue of the sky's vellum, hineni. Here I am, again, reading the clouds' ellipses, following their drift into glimpses of a divinity I must divine. God of the infinite possibilities of sand I was sculpted from, hineni. Here I am, again and infinitely a boy, with bucket and shovel, still wanting to sculpt something almighty out of the sparkly grains of myself, something sacred that can't be washed away, something eternal. God of the sunset's tangerine eye, burning holy between eyelids of sky and sea, hineni. Here I am, again, called by your gaze to ask once again, what would you have me do with this undone life? Here, as I am, again, hineni. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Richard. Another of Letras Latinas' mission is to enrich the education of our students, including our graduate students. And whenever there's an opportunity to provide an occasion for graduate students to introduce our featured poets, we do that. So I want to invite to the podium Emiliano Gomez, who is a MFA candidate in poetry. Please join me in welcoming him.
Once upon a time, there was a soldier who marched to Mictlan in his soldier boots, and every step was a soldier step, and every breath was a soldier word. Do you know what this soldier said? So flows the march of his unpeopled Eden, this Rigoberto tempo, a Gonzalez special. Gosh, this guy's not gonna talk like this the whole time now, or is he? Dizzy little thing called language. Pain is rarely so written, but here it's rewritten and rewritten as a queer taboo. Trauma's sum, a patriarchal death cult. Trauma's son on Atrocity Street, everywhere USA. Unpeopled Eden is one of 7, parenthetical show book, here collected. Black Blossoms intonates inquiry. Its syllabics swell through sweltering erotics, this poet's soft tongue lapping up the often unbearable but rarely barren. Other fugitives kinkily and desperately demands, good boy. Decades later, dispatch answers, confident butterfly. I am taken with this collection. Paul Valéry, the Ralph Lauren of criticism, expounded, poetry forces poetic feeling into poetry. It makes you want to make. Poe, the inventor of criticism, expounded, respond to art with art. Voilà, qui está, like so. Parenthetical show book. The boy who was night is the only son holy, el hijo santísimo, a trove of pearls, pearl clutchers, secrets, suicides, missing fathers. Missing fathers. I'm simpatico. To know death divine, is it an allegro? No. A dirge? No. It is a beauty who sips tea made from flakes of gold. Still not quite. An architecture of abandonment? Yes. Well, don't forget it's also the inverted nipple, a sense of humor, be blessed. In face of slaves and fury and fallen fruit, Rigoberto sings these songs as a one-man ensemble. I could just leave it there. I wrote this under a full moon. St. Joseph's Lake was baby indigo, and water bugs were bounded ripples. I wrote this a recent yesterday. That's memory, a recent yesterday. Rigoberto's twisting yesterdays, the avant-garde and the formalists at large may snap and nod, is both spiraling and sparse. It sees shadows twitch, the brain heart hold, and a fever love. Its pains flow where joy has stopped. As poetry unclogs, he makes his pains as bright as a bright boy can be. Gleefully join me in welcoming a G, the poet, Rigoberto Gonzalez.
When Francisco was mentioning Spain, there's so many wonderful memories, strange memories, but one of the ones that I cannot shake is that he invited me to go see a play. ¿Dónde estás? Oh, there. Remember that play? And it was the first time I encountered all the range of accents from Spain, so I could understand maybe one or two of the actors. And it was like a long play, and it seemed like everybody was having a great time. It was a funny play, and I just sat there like, wow. La Pelona is bird woman, and La Pelona is the nickname that Frida Kahlo had for death. Tonight, I dare to crawl beneath the sheets to be nailed down around me, waiting for my lover, she who enters without knocking, she who will unstitch my every seam along my thigh, my side, my armpit, she who carves a heart out of the heart and drops it down her throat. Sweet surrender this, slow death in sleep, as I dream the lovemaking is autopsy. How else will I be hers completely? Be her treasure box, I said, a trove of pearls and stones, the ding of coins cascading through her fingers, the bird over her shoulder, not a parrot, but an owl, to be my mirror when I close my eyes and shape a moon-white bowl out of my face where she can wash the hooks of her caress. Still with water, I'm one more thing to penetrate. I'm one more spill of secrets on the floor. A puddle glowing green, she doesn't have to be a sleuth to see I've taken all the antifreeze. A puddle thick with red, she'll kneel next to my wounds and pray for me. A string of pigeon skulls her rosary. By dawn, our bone pieta breaks out of its shadow, unleashes its cicada cry. My daughters drag their bodies, bruised as bats, out to the light and burst into flames like marigolds. The crows will leap down from the trees to pick them clean. And my beloved bride, beloved wife will laugh until it hurts her teeth. It's the feather of her tongue, 11th finger, I recall, and not the catheter while the priest recites his holy dribble and the churchyard workers take a leak. My sons hold up their chins with pride that they have done their part to hide my suicide. They've clipped my fingertips to lose the track back to my prints. But my beloved knows. She crouches on the highest branch and drops an egg that cracks my coffin. Concussion light squirms through, and I'm in heaven once again. Those times we screwed like hen and rooster, I, the squawking chicken, blacking out, and she, that hammering cock. This next poem was commissioned by Ada Limon for MoMA. And she was very classy about it because we could go to the museum and pick any of the paintings, and I just happened to pick the one that she had picked, and she withdrew her poem and probably wrote another brilliant one. So this is Cholo Squinting, and this is after Rufino Tamayo's Animals. And the other thing you should know is that my grandmother is Purepecha. Cholo Squinting, after Rufino Tamayo's Animals. Or in my grandmother's tongue, Huichuecha. Or does it matter? The bite is just as cruel. I would know. I stood safely behind the gate with the family dogs at my side. Pepe so hairy and loud, Pina so small but vicious. When the boys who pestered me at school walked by, I threatened to let the dogs out. The boys laughed at my sudden courage, me flanked by these nervous animals whom I had not seen attack anyone, not even my uncle, the man who stuffed their puppies in a sack. The log struck, and then the night grew quiet without the whimpering. Pepe and Pina became even angrier after that, barking at passers-by with such force, my mother was certain that one of these days the dogs would lunge from the roof and tear a body apart. I began to imagine canine teeth sinking into flesh, a fountain of blood and a fountain of tears, cartoonish yet horrifying, like Ojo Canica's fake eye. How at birthday parties he would grant a boy's wish and place the eye on top of a slice of cake. The children cackled while the old man looked sullen, resigned to the truth that this was the only reason he was ever invited. Oh, the aches of my childhood. Here is how to fill a dog with pain by clobbering its heart. Here is how to pluck a man's dignity and pretend it's all in fun. And here is how to tell a boy who made me touch him that I like him too. With the hook of my finger, I opened the gate's latch. I'm going to keep it at 3 poems. Otherwise, Richard's going to talk behind my back. He read 4. And I read 3. So this was a poem that was commissioned. I don't do commissions for my friends, and this is why. Because then I write the poem, and then they tell me that they censored it, that they had to take a couple of words out because they had to read them in public. So this was my friend's wedding, and he asked me for a poem, so I wrote this poem. And then he said, yeah, but I had to take a couple of words out. I was like, why do you do that? It's like, well, my mom was in the audience. She was in front. What do you want me to do? So I'll just read this and I'll end with this. It's called Two Widowers from Aguascalientes. And in Aguascalientes, the people from Aguascalientes are called hidrocálidos. Not so strange. Oh, one more thing. There's a certain speech idiosyncrasy from certain rural areas in the South, and that's adding a apostrophe N. So they would say, for example, Guadalajara puesten. Not so strange at all, this queer arrangement between 2 hidrocálidos who lost their wives, neighbors puesen, guava farmers both. Don Artemio's mustache matches a seagull's silhouette of hair connecting Don Lucho's collarbones. Of course, none of us had ever seen their spouses when they were supposedly alive. Gossips claim the graves are empty, though some swear the men have cried before their crosses, and others say that's where they buried their beloved horses, a stallion and a strawberry roan that, like their masters, never trotted out alone. Who could blame the men for grieving such losses? If the priest did not object to holy burial, well, pray your outrage at the renovated apse. La chingada thing would have collapsed atop the altar boys without the guava funds by now. On Saturdays, the men ride side by side on the guava truck. Don Lucho takes the wheel. Don Artemio tips his leather Stetson, Pueston. The load of guavas in the back blows kisses from the road. Señoritas swear by them and tempt their lovers with their pussy pink inside the nugget. Nuns grind the seeds and stir the powder into milk to induce erotic dreams, I think. What do you think? Nah, I'll just pluck the fruit off the trees, save a few to make my pulque a real working man's drink. I don't judge and I don't say, and even if I catch a glimpse of Don Artemio feeding guava slices to Don Lucho, men without wives still long for tenderness in their lives. The lesson in Aguascalientes is that the heart's the center in everything. The guava, the mouth, that bites it, the palm of a man's hand wiping juice off another man's chin. Call it sin, I'd call it Eden if it hadn't lasted, this paradise made complete when two widowers push their empty beds together. Thank you. Do I stay here? Okay.
So when I conceptualized tonight's program, I was inspired by what took place last April between Ada Limon, Carmen Jimenez, and Heidi Andrea Restrepo Rhodes. And what I asked Rigoberto and Richard to do for part 2 of our program was to read each other's new and selected poems and select 2 poems for the other person to read. So we're going to hear Rigoberto read 2 poems. We're going to hear Richard read 2 poems, but they were selected by the other poet. And then they're going to ask each other some questions. And our moderator for the next segment will be Susana.
Rigoberto reading one of the poems Richard selected.
Okay. Are these?
I think.
Are they on?
You might have to repeat again.
Are the mics on? Yeah. Yeah, no, that's not what I'm asking. Okay, so is Susan on? Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Okay, there we go. So, stars breaking?
All right. You are so hateful. You know why?
Why?
Because you picked the only poem that has a typo.
Well, it shows you what a good proofreader I am. I had no idea.
I didn't notice that until I read it out loud and I realized that's a typo. You know, and the thing is that's my fault because they give you so many times to look at the work. And it kind of works and nobody notices, but you know, I just say, you know what, I'm just gonna be transparent about it. So it's about the piñata, right? The stars breaking, and there's a line in here that says heavy heats first. It's supposed to be heavy hearts, but it works as heats.
Yeah, there we go.
But I didn't come up with it, so I'm not gonna read that. Anyway, I'm gonna read it as hearts, if I remember. Stars breaking. We've always been violent towards stars. As children, stick in hand, we strike at the piñata in the dark. Our cousins guide near misses with screams. Our mothers suck in their tongues in fear that we might club the neighbor's son and knock him to the hospital again, the way one random swing finding his head did last year. But not even a bleeding ear or a bandage the color of crushed plums could stop us from sharpening the 7 tasseled cones and raising yet another star up. That plump-bellied sacrifice waiting for the rib-shattering blow that throws its contents out, heavy hearts first. These rewards are enough to pacify the savages in all of us, and no skull cracking or tearing open of skin as easily as the pink tissue-thin paper can keep the stars from hanging or us from the inflicted wound and victorious unhooking. This doesn't keep you up anymore, abuelo, bedridden, broken-boned, and outnumbered by a riot of children shrieking like witches on the patio. Last week you fell off a horse. Tonight that horse was galloping without you. Even from that there was a lesson to be learned. You said we are only mass, becoming heavier with age, until nothing can endure the clefts of our wrinkles, the thickness of our calluses and toes. Listening to the posada in your sleep, what, abuelo, can you make me understand from that? Unafraid to hear a clay and paper star break open like a peanut shell between our back teeth. We've always known those stars are loose like overcoat buttons. They are the elbow scabs. They're the eye put out by the firecracker, one of the firecracker's sudden eyes. They're the glass of the soon-blown fuse. They're decapitations at the guillotine, destined long ago to come tumbling down. Piñata stars teach us the valuable lesson of defeat, the lesson of the fall into the dark and how we each follow that identical path. They show us not to be disappointed by our loss of strength or by our separation from the sky. We are as temporary as these piñata stars, which masquerade their mortality with 3 shades of gold that, like the crowns of your 2 front teeth, abuelo, will glitter to the very end. Until that instant when sound overthrows light, when the blindfold becomes a permanent one, and the cries become distant as moons or stars. Stars because they float above you, because you don't need to see them to know they're no longer part of what you are.
And so my questions, I'll just read verbatim, but as we develop them. So it starts breaking. So family obviously figures prominently in most poets' work for obvious reasons, right? But for Latino and queer and immigrant, migrant, exile poets like us, that goes kind of double at points at times. In Stars Breaking, you render a beautifully haunting, blatantly honest, and multivalent portrayal of Abuelo. Though the poem is fairly straightforward, can you tell us a little bit more about your abuelo's life or a witness of his life, how it affected your own? What were those valuable lessons of defeat that you note in the poem? And more specifically, how did abuelo and other male figures, or even the absence of them, shape your manhood, your queerhood, your Latinohood, and all their intersections?
Yeah. Well, you know, it's one of the rare times that I write about my mother's father. Usually I write about my father's father, who raised me. But my mother's father was always a very sort of blurry figure. He was very religious, but everybody went to church on Sundays. He would go to church on Wednesdays because it was very private for him, his relationship to God and also to his faith. And so I appreciated that sort of that intimacy and that sense of taking ownership of of manhood. As the vulnerability was very private. He was never vulnerable in public, right? That's one of the things. So I think that's why he wanted to go to church. And I've only saw him cry once, and that was after my mother died. It was the only time I saw my grandfather cry. But one of the things I do remember so much about him is that he was very quiet, very reserved, very gentle, but he was always very willing to be present. He showed up to everything. He showed up to everybody's school graduations, looked like he had just come down from the mountain, but that's fine. We accepted that. But I think that the even those fleeting moments of vulnerability, knowing that he had a private relationship to God that we weren't privy to, and also that moment of hearing him cry, and he didn't know that I was witnessing that because he went up. He had his house, and in the back we kept like the pigs and the goats, and I was out there kind of away from all the fuss down the house, and so he went up there to cry privately. So he didn't know idea that I was there, and he cried, and I felt, even though he didn't know that I was there, that I had somehow been invited to this moment of vulnerability, and that's how I always remember him and I always see them, and so and the other thing that I associate him with, because even when he had Alzheimer's towards the end of his life, he kept telling the same story that he fell off a horse. And this is before the poem was written, way before that. And it seemed like to be like that I tapped into the one moment that for him defined not only that vulnerability, but also that strength. And so I began to see that crying up at by the pigsty as not only a show of vulnerability, but a show of strength, because he allowed himself, to express that, even though he didn't know there was being witnessed. And so the same thing with this, I fell off a horse, was not only I failed as a horse rider, but I survived it.
Right.
And so that's like that's what I connect with.
Yeah, I mean, maybe that's also why I connected with the poem on almost not a subconscious level, but sort of another level with sort of male figures in my family too, is making me think about that. My father was, he was like a piece of furniture in the sense of, but he was there. He was always there.
Exactly.
It was this, he wouldn't show the vulnerability, but there was a tenderness in showing up and in, cool. And now?
Yes. And now Richard's going to read Maine Yet Miami, which Rigoberto selected.
Which Emma,
If you need it, I think I have one.
I got it. Maine Yet Miami. I guess I think I mentioned, but I split my time fairly recently between Maine and my native Miami. Maine Yet Miami. The soft harp of snowfall plucking through my pine trees lulls me to peace, and yet I still hear the bongo of thunderstorms rapping on the rooftop of my queer childhood, dancing to the rage of clouds, raining away my sorrow. Soon the snow will melt silently into the gurgles of my creek, even as my grandmother's voice remains frozen in my ears each time she'd call me a sissy, yet also praised me as her best friend. I marvel over spring's abracadabra every time the lilac blooms appear, only to disappear back into my grandfather's tobacco smoke, exhaling nostalgic stories about his lost Cuba, inhaling the scent of his jasmine tree flowering the night with its tiny perfumed stars. Despite the stars peeking through the lavender clouds swaddling the mountain peaks in my window at sunset, I rise to the sun of my youth rising over the sea after a night's sleep on a bed of sand, dreaming of dreading who I'd become or wouldn't. Though I grew courageous enough to marry a man who only loves me in English, darling, sweetheart, honey. I love him in my Spanish, whispered in his ears as he sleeps. Amorcito, tesoro, mi cielo. After all the meatloaves and blueberry pies we've baked in our kitchen, I still sit down to the memories of my mother's table, savor my loss of her garlicky fricassé de pollo and coconut flan. No matter how tastefully my throw pillows perfectly match my knickknacks and art on the walls, it all falls apart sometimes, just as I do, until I remember to be the boy I was, should always be, playing alone with his Legos in the family room, still enchanted by the joy of his sheer self and his creations, mortal as the life I've made here.
I just love grandparent poems. I don't know what it is about. But so this poem works beautifully as a series of bridges between contrasting energies. Locations, Maine, Miami, languages, English, Spanish, timelines, past, present, cultures, American, Cuban. But it's the emotional journey of the poem that draws me in. The tough love of the grandmother, the bittersweetness of memory and nostalgia for places and people that might also be hostile to the queer speaker. For this speaker, what is the bridge between queerness and acculturation?
Yeah, it's, and we talked about a little bit about this afternoon. The bridge has been my grandmother in some ways. When I first started to write about my queerness, well, I should say I hadn't written about it because I hadn't found a way into it, and I didn't understand what was the story I wanted to tell. So I am a gay man. So what, right? Every human being has a distinct story, including a gay man. And my grandmother's tough love, as I said, became a way to discuss that, or I should say something to explore, and thinking about a lot of layers that intersected then with my culture, and also what I came to think of as cultural sexuality, right? This idea of that those two things are intertwined, and that my sexuality in a way has to do with my longing for home and all the family poems and all this, so that place of belonging as well, in terms of safe space, in terms of community, in terms of a supportive environment. But what I figured out is that, and I allude to, but there's many more poems about grandma, and she's in the memoir, as she said, would call me a sissy and my best friend. And that was one of the most complex relationships that I had, because, again, through the writing, I realized that it was the one person that loved me most and hated me most. And that's a really complex thing to take in. And also, culturally, and I was sharing, it's kind of a little bit funny, but it's not so. She was also very xenophobic, so like anything that was too American, she also lumped into being queer. So oatmeal was queer. So she factors into that formula of home, sexuality. Like, she just became the catalyst, the force with which to tell my story as a gay Cuban man.
Thank you for these two kind of very contrasting grandparent poems, but not so contrasting. So now, Rigoberto, do you want to read Casa?
Sorry, Casa. This is actually inspired by a book called Exiles in Eden by Paul Reyes. This was it took place in Florida, actually. He was during the housing, where the bubble burst down in Florida, where all these people were the banks gave them loans to buy houses, and then nobody could afford to keep up the payments, so all these houses were repossessed. So Paul, when he was in college, he went home for the summer job, and his father's task was to clean out the homes that were foreclosed. And one of the interesting features about these homes is that when people lost their homes, they just walked out. Like, they would not take anything. Like, that's it, because they lost their homes, so they lost, like, their soul, right? And so then they just, even the family photographs, people would just walk out, like they had lost it. So that's it, didn't mean anything, which I thought was the most bizarre and sadly moving thing. So this is Casa. And this is in the point of view of the house. I am not your mother. I will not be moved by the grief or gratitude of men who weep like orphans at my door. I am not a church. I do not answer prayers, but I never turn them down. Come in and kneel or sit or stand. The burden of your weight won't lessen, no matter the length of your admission. Tell me anything you want. I have to listen, but don't expect me to respond. When you tell me you have lost your job, or that your wife has found another love, or that your children took their laughter to another town, you feel alone and empty? Color me surprised. I didn't notice they were gone. Despite the row of faces pinned like medals to my walls, I didn't earn them. The scratches on the wood are not my scars. If there's a smell of spices in the air, blame the trickery of kitchens or your sad addiction to the yesterdays that never keep, no matter how much you believe they will. I am not a time capsule. I do not value petty things like locks of hair and milk teeth and ticket stubs and promise rings, mere particles of dust I'd blow out to the street if I could sneeze. Take your high school jersey and your woman's wedding dress away from me. Sentimental hoarding bothers me. So off with you, old couch that cries in coins as it gets dragged out to the porch. Farewell, cold bed that breaks its bones in protest to eviction or foreclosure or whatever launched this grim parade of exits. I'm not a pet. I do not feel abandonment. Sometimes I don't even see you come or go or stay behind. My windows are your eyes, not mine. If you should die inside me, I'll leave it up to you to tell the neighbors. Shut the heaters off. I do not fear the cold. I'm not the one who shrinks into the corner of the floor because whatever made you think this was a home with warmth isn't here to sweet talk anymore. Don't look at me that way. I'm not to blame. I granted nothing to the immigrant or exile that I didn't give the border crosser or the native born. I'm not a prize or a wish come true. I'm not a fairy tale castle, though I used to be, in some distant land inhabited by dreamers now extinct. Who knows what happened there? In any case, good riddance, grotesque fantasy and mirth. So long, wall-to-wall disguise and vulgar suede and chintz. Take care, you fool, and don't forget that I am just a house, a structure with a soul for those whose patron saints are longing and despair.
Let's see why I love that. So, Casa, I'm forever amazed by the capacity of persona and personification poems like this to explore and interpret themes that are proverbial themes like home that are often so cliched or just like, just overworn in some ways. I love this poem in that sense of the perspective it offers. It's masterful. It's the fourth, it's from the fourth collection, I believe, for the Unpeopled Eden, which is roughly halfway marked between your first book and the new poems of the volume. And as you can rightfully imagine, I'm curious as I wonder where you stood, so to speak, emotionally, psychologically, spiritually, et cetera, on the matter of home when this poem was written. What led you up to this poem and what happened since that poem with respect to home, to casa?
Well, in I think it's in the second book, Black Blossoms, I wrote the line, and it's about the death of one's mother. And it said, the woman next to you is a place of your birth, right? And so this book, Unpeopled Eden, is actually written after the death of my father, which was a very different kind of loss. And so I think that's why this poem found its way into that collection, because it was a loss that I was trying to reconcile for another complicated figure in my life, my father, who after the death of my mother at 12, I was 12, and then at the age of 13, the next year, my father just kind of left and began a different life with a different family. And so that, I never forgave him for that abandonment, even though he tried many times to try to reconcile. And so then when he died, I thought, well, that conversation not only did it never get started, it's never gonna end now. It's kind of left suspended, right? And so that's where psychologically, emotionally, that's where I was. So that Unpeopled Eden is what happens to the spaces left behind when the bodies, the memories, the people are gone, right? And so it's for if in the line that I mentioned earlier that the woman next to you was the place of your birth, I thought, well, what is then my father in this sense? Is that another place of my birth? And I thought, well, it certainly is the place of my awareness of life, the place of my awareness of who I am. The mother too, but the father was just very different because there's nothing like knowing that there is this person, and with the abuela, that once they see you, you begin to see yourself through their eyes as well, which can be both damaging and hurtful, but it can also be a wonderful thing when they express love and they say, well, what is it that this person loves about me? What is it they appreciate about me? But also, what is it that they dislike about me? You begin to adopt the same kind of relationships with yourself, right? And so the loss of that then means, well, what do I do with all that? Because now I don't have anybody that's looking at me that same way.
The house is empty.
And the house is empty.
Yeah. When you started that anecdote, that was like coming all together.
Yeah.
Like, sense of abandonment. I'm like,
How do you feel like you find that when you write from the perspective of like not a human, like how do you feel like that voice like comes into shape?
Well, I usually don't. And that was the first book that I did. And I think there's 2 poems in there. But that prepared me for the next book, because in the next book, because I thought, okay, the first book is about the border and my family. The second book is all women. The second book is all men. The third book is all women. And then there's my father. And I thought, well, what happens after I'm people eaten? I said, well, let me then write about the elements. Let me then write about things. And the last book, which I'm forgetting the title. What's the title of my last book? The last book, anyway.
Book of Ruin?
The Book of Ruin, thank you. That's embarrassing. In that book, it's so many persona, because I was finding, because it's the Book of Ghosts. Mm-hmm. That's what it is.
Yeah. It's when you told the anecdote about your grandfather and the horse, like I had actually thought that was a Pedro Páramo reference, because there's that.
Oh, yeah.
There's that fall and there's the horse.
Yeah, and actually I think Juan Felipe Herrera in the blur mentions Pedro Páramo and the people didn't.
Yeah.
And I thought, because he knew, because no, he's right, you're right, it is.
It's very, yeah. So do you want to read The Island Within?
Oh, yes,
or did
that's
you
right.
Wanna...
Like, I was just getting
Getting
away.
You just lost the conversation.
You know Ruth, right? Of course, Ruth Behar.
Of course.
This is a poem dedicated to a dear friend of mine, who is actually an ethnographer, cultural anthropologist, and Cuban, Jewish, poet. It's just brilliant. Like, she makes. I think there's 10 of her, because there's a new book like every 3 days. But anyway, long-standing relationship as friends, as colleagues, as artists, as Cubans. The Island Within, for Ruth Behar. I am still thinking about your porch light, like a full moon casting a foggy halo in the frigid air last night. The bare oaks branching into the sky like nerve endings, inches away from the frozen stars. The pink gables of your Victorian home protesting yet another winter for you, captive in Ann Arbor, as you practice mambo by the fireplace. I'm following your red velvet shoes to conga beats and bongo taps, taking your body, but not your life, from the snow mantling your windows outside, 1,600 miles away from Cuba. I'm tasting the cafecito you made, the slice of homemade flan floating in burnt sugar, like the stories you told me you can't finish writing. No matter how many times you travel through time back to Havana to steal every memory, ever stolen from you. You're a thief anyone would forgive. Wanting only to imagine faces for names chiseled on the graves of your family at Guanabacoa. Walk on Calle Aguacate and pretend to meet the grandfather you never met at his lace shop for lunch. Or pray the Kaddish like your mother at the synagogue in El Vedao. Stand on the steps there like you once did in a photo you can't remember taking. I confess, I pitied you. Still trying to reach that unreachable island within the island you still call home. I thought I was done with Cuba, tired of filling in the blanks, but now I'm not sure. Maybe if I return just once more, walk the sugarcane fields my father once cut, drive down the road where my mother once peddled guavas to pay for textbooks, sit on the porch with my grandmother's house, imagine her still in the kitchen making arroz con leche. Maybe then I'll have an answer for you. Last night, when you asked me, would you move to Cuba? Would you die there?
Thank you. So the conversation between Cuban exiles is so unique that only they can truly understand the premise that an island that's 90 miles away from the Florida coast is unreachable. Distance is also measured by the years of separation, the aging self, the fading memories, the time spent living with a feeling of loss and longing for home. The starting question at the end of the poem is charged with implications because it's challenging the speaker to consider if healing or reconciliation is even possible anymore. Re-entering is not the same as returning. How can Cuban poets sustain such nuanced conversations during this period of divisiveness and simplistic assumptions made about Cuban exiles, Cuban Americans, and their participation in Florida politics?
Been thinking about that one for a while.
Yeah.
I'm not sure I could answer all of that, but I sort of have some thoughts that I think sort of float around a lot of that. One of the things is, I think when you mentioned saying specifically Cuban poets, right? And I think when you say that, I think it's also obviously our generation, right? So I think that's always been a job of ours, like to mediate, to find the nuances, to celebrate our culture, but then also push back against it, right? To be educators of our elders in some ways, to in terms of shifting some of their dynamic, their positions, right? I'm happy to report my mother, for the first time, voted Republican and for a woman for Hillary Clinton. And so we've opened up that conversation because I think it partly of who I am, right, and what I do in the world. So anyway, I think that's part of our poets, our roles as poets, and particularly, as I said, of that generation. One thing about the idea of whether you can come back, go back, or whatnot, it comes to mind for me that when Castro died, for years everybody's waiting for Castro to die. Castro's going to die, as if the world's going to change. And I remember when that happened, and I wasn't living my part-time just yet. I just felt this really sadness, because the next day was Tuesday and nothing changed. And all these years of waiting for something that was just mythological, fighting some kind of myth that just wasn't even, it's just like, it was so anticlimactic in a way. And it made me, so that was one observation that I had, where these kind of, the psychopolitics, if you want, of what happens in Miami, and not all Cubans, of course. But there's kind of also another thing that I've come to think a lot about, is that, I don't know if my therapist told me this once, but it's easier to scream than to cry. And I think that a lot of the older generation Cubans, that it's really hard to accept that loss. It's hard to deal with it. They act like they do, but they're not. They keep on sweeping it under the nostalgia rug. And again, when Castro dies, we're going back. And so not dealing with that pain or that loss, or accepting it in some ways, all's fair in love and war, right? Somewhat, gets channeled into this politics, gets channeled into screaming, gets channeled into a falsified, also kind of a cognitive dissonance, right? And those kinds of political stances, or this idea, I'm not going to Cuba because until that man is dead, well, he's dead now. But it's not that they don't want to go to Cuba because of the politics, or just because of the politics. To me, there's also, why would you go back to a place where you knew, why would you go back to the Gulf Motel, right, if you knew it was going to be ruined, or at least it was ruined from how you remember it. And that kind of, for me, I've seen, and again, being sort of the intermediary, of the observer, that kind of leaks into all these kinds of really sort of strong stances and political stances. And I think we see that also in some other Latinos, but I think also in Cubans, you got to mix in this idea of exile too, right? It's like, so on the one hand, they're super grateful for this country and like what yada yada, but we're going back, and that creates a kind of odd dichotomy. We're part of this country, but not part of this country, and then they become also like sort of one-issue voters. It's just like, who's the person that's going to give us back this Cuba, which is an impossibility. Doesn't matter what you think politically; it's just an impossibility. I've been to Cuba; it's never gonna. Well, you can't go back to 1958 anywhere, nowhere, right? I was just telling my mother the other day. She said something about no, because in Cuba, I'm like, Mom, it was like that here too in 1958. Like, it has nothing to do with Cuba. Of course, the food tasted better or something like that. It was because they weren't, there wasn't GMOs and all this stuff. So I don't know. It's this perpetual tightrope that they keep on walking. And like I said, I think my role at least I see, is to sort of think about those nuances and yeah.
Yeah, there's so much more. I feel like we
like my husband says, don't press the Cuba button. It's like 4 hours.
No, yeah. I mean, before moving on to the next section, I was just wondering, because like you both, in both your poems, kind of talk about like reconciliation as like an impossibility and a and like, do you feel like the poem is a space that offers that, or is that kind of an illusion that like that the poem can like reconcile certain like impossible feelings?
You mean in this particular context, or?
Yeah, like for you in this context, and like for Rigoberto, like for dealing with like the relationships that we can no longer heal after someone has passed. For you, like this relationship with Cuba that no longer exists. Like, is the poem a vehicle for that, or does the poem happen anyway, and the grief is there? Anyway?
Well, it's breaking silence, right? You were saying that it's when you sweep it under the nostalgia bar, or you keep it silent. That's another kind of damage, right? Another kind of hurt that. Or another wounding. And so even acknowledging, right, that it's there, that it exists, that even acknowledging that something cannot be fixed, at least owns up to that something exists, as opposed to, oh no, I'm okay, nothing's there, nothing's wrong, which the inside has a very different way of dealing with that, and so then you hurt yourself.
Right. Yeah.
I think that's for me in the poem. I wanted to, like, in a way, I wanted to put Cuba behind, like sweep it also into, like, I'm done with Cuba. I can't deal with this anymore. But I'll answer also I think in a related way. I agree, like it's reconciliation, but for me it's also about accepting the ambiguity of life, right? That we're often, also when we teach poetry, it's really hard sometimes for students to live in the ambiguity of something, that it's not black or white, it's not, it's both. Poetry is often both, and in that way it's also kind of a reconcile, right? But it allows me to be okay with living in a question, because at least I looked at the question. Right. At least I'm understanding the question better by writing a poem.
Right, yeah. All right, shall we move on to Luis Omar Salinas?
Sure.
Yeah.
So this is from the Library of America, and we're tasked with selecting a poem that we were struck by or gravitated toward. This is from Luis Omar Salinas, and the poem is that my name is Omar. I suffer that my name is Omar Salinas, that I want to touch someone in the incredible loneliness of nights, that I frighten away those I should be close to. I suffer when I go crazy and can't love anyone. Whether it is Tuesday or Sunday, I suffer. I suffer a lust for fame and immortality, that I try to commit suicide, that I have compassion for the unfortunate. I suffer the death of matrimony, the death of my mother, the eyes of God. I want to understand this and that and come up with zero. What should I do but walk and look at the lovely sky? And so the reason that I gravitate toward this poem is that, contemporary poetry, we see how poets are negotiating some very difficult subjects, especially younger poets. There's a different relationship to emotion, to mental health, to the pains that we are moving through this world, to faith, right? And so Luis Omar Salinas was writing at a time where this is like a poet from the 70s, 80s. That was his heyday. Where male poets were not doing this. They were not being vulnerable on the page. They were not, because that was again going back to the question that Richard said, that would question masculinity. That was considered a weakness, right? Which is the reason I think that so many men hurt themselves, because they don't allow themselves to be human, to be vulnerable. Right? And so this is a poet who is doing that on the page and just being very upfront, very honest about it, right? And also giving exact language. Like, he wasn't being coy, he wasn't working with these with metaphors, saying very clearly, it says suicide, very clearly it says the end of my, because that's something that he suffered through the entire life, was that his marriage didn't work out. And that was like the love of his life. And even towards the end of his life, it was something that he always dealt with. He said that his loneliness, because he didn't have the love of his life. So to carry that pain all the way through, and also to write it down, right? So that now it's like, I can't remember when he passed away, but here we are still reading about that pain. And so that's an interesting gift to the rest of us. It's like, there's, going back to your question, is there something there that we can learn from? And also, can we draw strength from that? Because I think even though there was still a lot of pain for him, that there was also a lot of strength.
Yeah, and I love this poem, and I think what's so striking about it is that it's so, like, filled with feeling, but it's so unsentimental, and his work is so unsentimental.
Yeah.
And, like, I think Gary Soto said that he had the quote is a propensity to deal directly with the facts, and that's really, like, his poems are always like this unmasking. And I feel like your poems are also very filled with feeling, but very unsentimental in the same way. And I wonder, like, if you have thoughts on, like, how can one, like, do that in poetry, like, say things as they are,
Well, I think that's also that's a part of the journey, because I think that if I knew how to be more sentimental, I think I would do it. And maybe I'm approaching that. Maybe, I say in my old age, right? Maybe in my old age, I'll finally get to those poems that I think I want to write. Because at the moment, I'm unable to write directly in front of that pain. So the advice I give my students is, if you can't write something, if you can't stand in front of something and write about it directly, then you stand on the side and you write about it from the periphery. And you're still approaching it, you're still close to it, but you are not blinded by it, or you're not, the fire's not going to burn you up because you're right in front of it.
Right, yeah. And is that kind of like where the other voices and characters, you think?
I think so, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Thank you. Should we move on to maybe part of Marti, or maybe the whole
I don't know
Marti?
how we're doing on time.
We're just past 6:30, so maybe...
Just read,
Okay.
just read the English.
Well, speaking about vulnerability,
Yeah.
I'll just read the first four, I think. So this is José Martí de Versos Sencillos. Yo soy un hombre sincero de donde crece la palma, y antes de morirme quiero echar mis versos del alma. Yo vengo de todas partes y hacia todas partes voy. Arte soy entre las artes, en los montes soy. Y sé los nombres extraños de las hierbas y las flores, y de mortales engaños y de sublimes dolores. Yo he visto en la noche oscura llover sobre mi cabeza los rayos de lumbre pura de la divina belleza. Alas nacer vi en los hombros de las mujeres hermosas y salir de los escombros volando las mariposas. And now, in English, this is a great translation. He's so hard to translate. And this is by,
What's the translation?
sure, give the translator proper credit, Anne Fountain. A sincere man I am, born where the palm trees grow, and I long before I die, my soul's verses to bestow. No boundaries bind my heart, I belong to every land. I am art among art, a peak among peaks I stand. I know the exotic names of every flower and leaf. I know of betrayal's claims, and I know of exalted grief. I've seen how beauteous streams flow through the dark of night and descend as radiant beams in a luminous shower of light. As if by wings set free, I've seen women's shoulders rise and beauty emerge from debris in a flight of butterflies.
So why did you choose this?
Well, very personal reasons. every Cuban knows this, like, right? So since you're a little kid, like, and heaven forbid someone breaks out a bottle of rum and they start singing my tea, and I think obviously I picked it for that. It's just part of my being, right? And my mother every once will go into one of these verses or any of my teas. But as in thinking about it for today, I think a couple things. One is that this made me realize how poetry can be part of our lives, and I think culturally different than the way sort of poetry is in America, and how my sense of my own poetry and what do I want my poetry to do in the world comes from this cultural attachment. I remember the first time I went to Cuba, my cousins, they're like, "You're a poet?" I'm like, "Yeah," and they're like, and they break out a bottle of rum and like a guitar and like, "Come sing then." Like, what do you mean sing? And they're improvising decimas and they're quoting my tea and like Nicolas Guillen, and I'm like, these are country folks. Like they're not, the idea that poetry is part of the folklore, it's part of life. And yes, there's high poetry and low, well, they don't look at it that way. They just see it as poetry, right? So that's one thing. And I think in a way, that also, what I love about this poem, my tea, is how the subject matter itself, right? It is the the things that are accessible to people in beautiful language. But I think what you choose to write about also in a way is a way of being political. And so, as Sandra Cisneros, I'll paraphrase, said to me one time, I want to write poetry that my bus driver wants to read, right? And by that we don't mean broken down, simple, like sort of course there's craft and of course paying strict attention to the rigors of the art, but the idea being that I want poetry that lives in the very people that I'm writing about, right? And I wanted to do both, right? I wanted to live it. I want to win a Pulitzer, and I want it to be also my proverbial bus driver, as they say. So I admire how his work just lives again in society, and on top of that, of course, he's an incredibly accomplished poet, sure, by all rights, right? Yeah. In the history of Latin American literature. So.
Yeah, and I feel like he was very intentional in that, in like writing in an octosílabo to have it be like popular song.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah, I feel like I was just thinking about how he wrote Versos Sencillos like in the Catskills, and then that felt so resonant to your main Yet Miami poem, right? Like these like cold landscapes and thinking about, but yeah, and also just like this attachment to like very beautiful lyrical language that's also plain spoken and also not sentimental, but it's beautiful.
The sentiment is played off by that incredible musicality. Like,
yeah.
So hard. I mean, it's just like, I've read translations and like, ugh. Yeah, no, this is a great translation. Do you feel like because of what you're saying of how he was so like prevalent, like these words were so prevalent, like do you feel like Martí was like something you kind of put aside as a poet as like an influence, or do you feel like he was like no, I just think that, and maybe this is my bad, I should say also was not an English major, so I don't come at poetry from that angle, but I was also educated, obviously, in English, so my capacity for, really, I have enough with one literary tradition, American, and so I look more to these poets in terms of more of like the cultural connection, but I didn't toss them aside in that sense. It's just something that well, frankly, also was never put in front of me either, right? Yeah. So, but yeah, and so like I've studied a little bit of Borges too, and obviously Neruda, and I think what I take from them though is that beauty of language that I think I reconstruct in my head. I tend to be a little at times too baroque, but I think my sensibility of language still comes from that kind of how that expression happens, right. Both in poetry and in family.
Right. Yeah. Do we have time for some audience questions, or?
I think we're.
Continue the conversation while they're signing books.
Okay, great.
So invite you all to the reception, and their books are for sale. The Library of American is for sale, and
thank you.